This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I am your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. It is now week 4 of September, and it seems in lieu of the land war in Europe, the Morgana have amplified their activity, attacking both cities and harbors of many nations across the globe. While it seems that most nations are handling it well, turmoil is beginning to fester among some nations' inner circles. First up, news from the League of Nations. With recent events, many members within the League have been pressing for more cooperation amongst both member nations and those outside of the League in combating the Morgana, and have found some success, but not without their detractors. This was seen after the latest meeting where the War Plan Case Neighborhood Framework passed with only 59% support. Despite differing opinions, the general trend of world affairs was lending itself to cooperation and collaboration against the inhuman threat. Gentle suggestions of a ceasefire in Poland were unfortunately brushed off. But there was the faintest flicker of a more unified response than there had been since the Great War. Newspapers and periodicals worldwide were already stationing correspondents in Geneva, as it appeared the crux of the Morgana War might be decided there. There was no doubt that there was a new kind of internationalism on the rise in the imaginations of those that wished to give something to the fight. Rumor has it that senior naval officers from countries still neutral in the European conflict are taking the initiative and are convening at a conference held in Napoli in the hopes of forming new guidelines on how to handle the global crisis. Next up, we have news from Italy, who seems to be setting a precedent as yet again the leading nation contributing to our united front. Recently, the Regia Marina had tamed the Red Sea and had made the waters of the eastern Mediterranean as safe for shipping as anywhere else in the world. And this week they moved to reduce the threat in the Black Sea, offering the Turks assistance beyond that which the British or the Soviets had been able to provide through the war plan Navigando verso Bisanzio, which found 65% support. Sources say that captains within the Regia Marina argued over what threat the Morgana trapped in the Black Sea could possibly pose. However, contained does not mean defeated, said an Italian captain, and raised concerns over the vast amount of resources within the Black Sea. It was a strategic and diplomatic win, dramatically reducing the odds that the Morgana could force the Dardanelles again and imperil this new Pax Italiana. These actions, fought on either side of the strait, secured the goodwill of the Turks, the League of Nations, and much of the wider world beyond. In the end of it all, the Aegean Sea now seemed almost Italian. In other news, the Palazzo Venezia saw a good deal of military traffic consequently. Orders are now flowing day and night, and Mussolini has been effusive in his praise for the naval arm of Italy. His rhetoric has grown to match as well. Tragically, however, the campaigns of the Regia Marina left the Ligurian Sea inadequately defended against an unexpected Morgana force that had previously contended itself terrorizing the coasts of French Tunisia. Genoa was raided as with yet unknown casualties. It is rumored that hundreds may have died or been captured, perhaps 1,000 or more. However, the people of Liguria found themselves wondering why their increasingly famous navy was looking for publicity thousands of kilometers away from home. In response, the Regia Marina protested that they expected more help from the Marine Nationale than they got, but that hardly helped their case at home. Perhaps this shows that the Regia Marina was relying too heavily on foreign aid to guard their home waters. Next up, we head across the Atlantic to hear major news from the United States, who continues to be the second leading nation against the Morgana threat. The course for America forever changed this week when Franklin Delano Roosevelt held a speech over the radio claiming it to be a talk on national security and of American independence. In his speech, he said, quote, "Frankly and definitely there is danger ahead, danger against which we must prepare. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war." Alongside this speech, Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced the enactment of the aptly named war plan Arsenal of Democracy, which found an overwhelming 84% support amongst governmental bodies. With the war in Europe, China, and most importantly, the Morgana, this was no doubt a call to support the democratic powers in Europe and to end America's isolation. What spurred such a rousing speech and the call for such decisive action were the events that occurred earlier this week, in which the United States was besieged by Morgana and suffered a heartbreaking attack. And then, when things seemed darkest, won a heroic victory. The Morgana had been shy around Hawaii recently, but at the start of this week they fell upon Honolulu Harbor in a disorganized yet frightfully brutal attack. The Morgana did not display any sense of feasible formation tactics, and their assault was mostly broken up by shore guns. However, they did spend 5 minutes in range of the city. Reports say it was a horrifying and indiscriminate attack against a civilian population that left hundreds dead and many more missing. Reports also state that slowly from the sea fog, more and more Morgana began to appear in the area, perhaps sensing soft targets. A warning has been issued by the United States Department of the Navy that all civilian vessels are strongly advised to avoid the region until further notice. 2 days later, the Morgana from the French Antilles went on a rampage near Florida, however, one that led to a very different outcome. The Battle of the Keys was a victory on a scale beyond even the Battle of Belle Harbor. 3 Morgana battleships and 2 aircraft carriers were destroyed, and a half a dozen destroyers were forced to flee, only to be hunted down days later near Cuba. The American people had been desperate for a victory, and the Roosevelt administration let them know that they had a big one. Navy recruitment had another surge, and Morgana traffic off the southeastern coast declined to a fraction of what it had been. Meanwhile, the Panama Conference began with the United States and its southern neighbors, and peripherally and unexpectedly Japan, discussing how peace and prosperity outside of Europe could be best safeguarded. Following that, we jump across the pond to hear news from the United Kingdom, who subsequently surpassed France this week as the 3rd contributing member to the war against the Morgana. After successful naval action in the southwestern approaches, clearing out many German U-boats, the United Kingdom decided it was time to turn their attention to their colonies, who were in dire need of the Crown's aid. The Prime Minister announced the enactment of War Plan and Empire If We Can Keep It, which found 70% support in the parliamentary houses. Subsequently, following that announcement, the United Kingdom turned the might of the Royal Navy toward the cause of relieving the coasts of India to dramatic effect. Morgana groups that had rampaged almost unimpeded between Bombay and Goa were duly educated about Britain's long-standing naval traditions. The Royal Navy delivered much-needed relief to the coastal cities themselves. This kindness would be remembered. The Indian Ocean remained dangerous and difficult, however, and the maintenance of the coast would not be an easy task. Many of the people of India may have maintained doubts about Prime Minister Chamberlain and the powers that were in London. But those that had lost and sought to avenge their fallen rushed to join the Royal Navy whenever they pulled into port. It was truly a show of compassion, cooperation, and unity amongst the Empire, one we hope to see continued in the future. Back at the home isles, reports in the fisheries were that the Germans were once again moving freely in the North Sea, and for the first time a German scout aircraft was shot down just north of the Fisher Bank. If the Germans have an easy transit of the North Sea, how long could it be before Scarborough was raided again? Worse so, mine-laying efforts were complicated over and over again by seemingly suicidal Morgana attacks. Could they possibly be testing the defenses for weak spots? Or could it be that the Morgana are trying to divert attention away so they can mount a massive offensive elsewhere? We'll have to see what the future holds. Following that comes news from France, the 4th contributing member to the United Front against the Morgana, only just falling behind the initiative set by the United Kingdom. However, that doesn't mean that the French aren't still putting up the good fight. With reports of troubling Morgana activity off their western shore, though some members of the government were hesitant, 66% voted in favor for the enactment of War Plan the alliance has tested. With joint operations with Italy's Regia Marina in the Mediterranean complete, the Marine Nationale gathered any fleets of vessels that could be spared before departing to the Bay of Biscay. And it was a good thing they did, as the Marine Nationale encountered and subsequently won a decisive battle against a superior Morgana force, all within sight of the Estuary de la Jonde. To top it off, photographs from the famous Tour de Cordouan, standing intact and proud in front of the seascape full of broken and burning enemy ships, became an instant rallying symbol for all of France. Naval recruitment has already soared as a result of this decisive victory, with many of the aspiring sailors wanting to serve aboard the ships which were so pivotal in winning the naval action offshore. Of note was the lone flagship Dunkirk, who, sources say, despite her shell-scored hull plating and No. 1 turret being inoperable, continued to fire at the Morgana fleet defiantly, reportedly sinking 3 cruisers and several destroyers on her own before sailing back to harbor under her own power. Seeing such action in person must truly have been a sight to behold. However, even if Morgana warships are now less visible in the Bay of Biscay, early indications suggest that submarines, particularly the Morgana Asphyxiation, seem to be attempting to fill the void. But as of this time, they are not yet present in enough numbers to reduce the importance of this great victory. On land, the French had a quieter, more complicated week. The French Communist Party was banned in its entirety, despite their pleas for a common front against the Morgana following Soviet actions in Poland. And on the front against Germany, plans for a second Saar offensive were shelved in favor of maintaining their defense at the Maginot Line. The offensives were deemed too impractical and too unlikely to succeed, and it appeared the Germans seemed to know it, with little to no reinforcement movements being reported. After that comes news from Germany, who surprisingly managed to surpass the Empire of Japan as the 5th-ranking nation in the war against the Morgana. Perhaps Germany is slowly coming around to the idea of supporting the United Front in lieu of their territorial ambitions. With their success in reminding the Allied powers of the reach of German U-boats, the powers that be in Germany's military command wanted to return home to defend the coastal waters. Orders subsequently came from Berlin enacting the war plan Eisen und Blut, with only 59% support of German military command, primarily the Kriegsmarine, in favor of this plan. Doing so may have saved a lot of lives as Morgana attacks intensified against Germany when 2 Morgana fleets, one in the Baltic and one in the North Sea, came ravening out of the mists, aircraft massing into a bombing campaign that might have turned Kiel into another Warsaw. The Kriegsmarine fought and took a hard-won victory over in the Baltic, and then, under the threat of enemy aircraft, made the transit of the Kiel Canal in time to defeat the Morgana attacking from the North Sea. The maneuver was so stunning and courageous it captured the imagination of the nation. The Belle of Schleswig-Holstein publicized the victory and the unflinching courage of the citizens of perhaps her most beloved city, and she joined hand in hand with the League of Nations to ask for the support of the entire world in reconstruction and in giving aid to the displaced citizens of Germany. The Kriegsmarine's focus on securing its home waters rather than pursuing the war in Poland gave hope to the Netherlands for assistance and cooperation in the near future. Despite that, the war in Poland continued. Soldiers of the Wehrmacht, bogged down against unexpectedly stiff resistance and without security forces on the river, were from all accounts less than impressed regarding the situation. Sources say the same sentiment seems to have been true of their generals as well, with one particularly vexed general stating that he was displeased by the reallocation of forces and supply when victory was in sight, and that he hoped military command would prioritize accordingly henceforth. For all that, though, the Luftwaffe was bombing Warsaw, and with the Wehrmacht poised in the western part of the city and Stalin's Red Army advancing from the east, it seemed that the only real question was where Berlin and Moscow would draw the final borders of whatever would replace the Republic of Poland. Needless to say, hard times are ahead for our Polish friends. Following that, we turn our attention to the Pacific with the Empire of Japan, the 6th contributing nation to the war against the Morgana. If there was one thing military officials in Japan knew, it was the concerns over a vital resource which serves as the lifeblood of their nation's defense: oil. Pressing for a solution, the war plan Oil Must Flow was enacted with a surprisingly low 62% support. Perhaps the growing animosity from the Imperial Japanese Army had something to do with it. Sources say that some junior army officers were against it out of spite for the Navy. Regardless of internal squabbling, Vice Minister Kishi was dispatched to Washington, pausing in Panama City to have a series of informal but meaningful discussions with Mr. Wells at the Panama Conference. No formal deals were made, but the Roosevelt administration signaled that it would not let Japan go without fuel in the weeks ahead, with further agreements about trade protection requiring elaboration by naval staff. The question of Japan's role in China, however, continues to hang like a pall over the proceedings. With the war continuing as it is, it's unlikely that the Empire of Japan will receive any large-scale support from America. Unfortunately, that was not the story which dominated the news in Japan this week. A Morgana fleet, battleships and all, turned their attention toward Tokyo Bay. Though weeks of preparation and increased investment in coastal defense prevented a catastrophic loss of life, the Morgana shelled the city and started numerous fires. The Imperial Palace was under their guns during most of the action and struck by a dud shell. It would only be through the energy and action of an army officer that the shell was safely defused. The threat to the Emperor was used as proof that the Navy was too disorganized and incompetent to properly do its job, and that perhaps the recent setbacks in Manchukuo in China should be understood in that light. The attack on Tokyo Bay will likely be a permanent stain on their record, one in which the Imperial Japanese Navy will have to work extra diligently for it to fade. If not corrected and allowed to happen again, the Empire of Japan could lose many more lives, or worse even, the Emperor himself. Lastly, we head back over to Europe to check in with our comrades in the North, the Soviet Union, the seventh contributing nation against the Morgana threat. This week, dread gripped the souls of Moscow's military command as the Soviets found themselves looking straight into the eyes of the coming maelstrom. The Morgana in the Arctic Circle, feared to be the densest concentration of the enemy on Earth, launched a major raid into the White Sea for supplies, and perhaps simply to spread terror. Opinions were divided in the Politburo on whether this information regarding the Morgana's fleet size was true, or a fabrication by foreign powers. Regardless, emergency orders came directly from Moscow, with Stalin himself ordering the enactment of War Plan, the Object of Terror, and subsequently mobilizing any and all units to repel the invaders coming from the north, even if it cost them their lives. The northern fleet at Polyani was the first to sortie. Outgunned and heavily outnumbered, captains fought with an unbridled ferocity in the face of this malevolent and murderous threat, and against all odds turned them back. Mines, submarines, and nightly torpedo raids shattered the enemy's formation, enabling the larger Morgana to be destroyed one by one. The Battle of Arkhangelsk was an unprecedented triumph, and as naval resources could not transit the White Sea Canal in time, the Northern Fleet was covered in all of the glory. The monumental success of the Northern Fleet cannot be overstated, and the courageous captains are surely to be rewarded by many medals for their efforts, with the Arctic region now a little bit safer as a result. In other news, the Soviet invasion of Poland overran the lightly defended border as expected. Like a red tide, they took Lwów, then won the Battle of Kherson, and then the Battle of Waterpole, with officials from Moscow reporting minimal casualties being taken. Without interference from Riverine Morgana, they may have joined the siege of Warsaw from the east. Instead, they entrenched and maintained their strength, waiting to see the result of the Northern Fleet. As a result, Poland would likely stand another week. Meanwhile, the Morgana Avarice took advantage of the relative quiet around the Finnish coast to see what treasures she might find. Hopefully, the Soviets aren't too busy celebrating their victory to properly deal with this new threat. And with that stirring report concludes the League of Nations War Report for week 4 of September. Even with the heightened rate of Morgana attacks, we encourage all nations to continue working together in order to tackle the Morgana threat. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana. But there is more you can do to help both on the front line and at home. Has a captain or belle caught your eye? Utilize some of that prestige you've earned to get them a tailored uniform or some nice formal dress wear from your local tailor. If you find yourself lacking in prestige to woo your fellow officers, consider buying some war bonds to help the war effort against the Morgana. This is the quickest way to support our boys and girls on the front line while also netting you fame among your peers that you can use to get that special someone regalia befitting only of them. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.